The courtroom had gone completely silent. Not the formal silence that Judge Diana Holloway maintained with an iron hand throughout her proceedings, the kind that fell when she raised one finger from the bench and every attorney in the room immediately stopped talking. This was a different silence, the kind that falls when something has gone wrong and nobody in the room knows how to fix it. On one side of the aisle sat a woman named Elena Vasquez, 31 years old, a Guatemalan immigrant who had been in this country for 9 years and whose 7-year-old son Miguel had been in foster care for the past 4 months while the state decided whether she was fit to raise him. Her attorney was court-appointed, overworked, and doing his best. Miguel sat beside a social worker in the second row, wearing a collared shirt that was slightly too big for him, his feet not quite reaching the floor. On the other side sat the state's representative and 2 attorneys from the Department of Child Services, all of whom had folders, laptops, and the particular confidence of people who won more cases than they lost. In the middle of all of it, at the interpreter's desk, where the certified Guatemalan Spanish interpreter named Rosa Fuentes had been sitting 20 minutes ago before she collapsed without warning and was currently being attended to by paramedics in the hallway, there was an empty chair. Nobody in courtroom 7 of the Hendricks County Courthouse spoke Guatemalan Spanish. Nobody except the man in the gray maintenance uniform standing frozen in the doorway, holding a mop and a yellow caution sign, who had walked in to clean up a spilled coffee and had not yet walked back out. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 43 years old. He had a daughter named Lily who was 7, exactly Miguel's age, and he had, in another life, spoken 6 languages, fluently enough to work in conditions where a mistranslated word could get people killed. He stood in the doorway and looked at the empty chair, and then he looked at Miguel. The boy was sitting very still in his collared shirt, looking at his mother across the aisle with the expression of a child who understood, on some level below words, that something important was being decided today, and that he did not have the tools to effect it. Marcus had seen that expression before. He had seen it in the mirror on the morning after Dana died, when Lily had come into the kitchen and looked at him with the same quiet, helpless waiting. He looked at the empty chair one more time. Then he set down the mop. If the kind of story where the person nobody notices turns out to be the one who changes everything, that's what this channel is about. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Marcus Webb had a system for Monday mornings, and it never changed. He was up at 5:30 before Lily stirred, before the apartment building's pipes began their morning complaints, before the city outside their window had fully committed to being awake. He made coffee in the kitchen, sat at the table in the specific quiet that existed only in that particular window of time, and did nothing for 20 minutes except drink it. It was the only part of the day that belonged entirely to him, and he protected it with the quiet ferocity of a man who had learned the hard way that the things you didn't protect eventually disappeared. By 6:15, Lily was up. He always knew the exact moment, a drawer sliding open in her room, the specific sound of her feet on the hardwood, and then her appearance in the kitchen doorway wearing whatever combination of clothing she had assembled with complete confidence and zero regard for matching. She was 7 years old and had strong opinions about her outfits. Marcus had stopped commenting on this approximately 2 years ago and considered it one of the better decisions of his parenting career. "Is it a school day?" she asked, the same way she asked every morning. "It's a school day," he said, the same way he answered every morning. She processed this with the solemnity of a judge reviewing a motion, then turned back toward her room to get dressed. Marcus watched her go and felt the particular quiet happiness that had no name, the kind that didn't announce itself, that simply sat in the chest like something warm and stayed there. He was not a complicated man to look at. Broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 40s, with close-cropped hair and a face that had been shaped more by attention than by age. He wore plain clothes, gray work shirt, dark pants, boots that had been resoled once. He drove a used Civic, lived in a two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building that had good heat in winter and a landlord who fixed things when asked, and he worked 5 days a week as part of the maintenance crew at the Hendricks County Courthouse. The job was honest. It asked nothing of him except attention and consistency. And both of those things Marcus gave freely because they cost him nothing and had never once let him down. In the front pocket of his work shirt, he carried a folded piece of paper, a drawing Lily had made 3 weeks ago, a courtroom, rendered in the specific visual language of a 7-year-old, with a very large judge behind a very large desk, and a small figure in a gray shirt pushing a mop in the corner. She had labeled the small figure Daddy in careful letters. He had laughed when she handed it to him, the real kind of laugh that came from somewhere unguarded, and he had folded the drawing and put it in his pocket, and it had been there every day since. He checked that it was still there each morning before he clocked in. The courthouse had its own rhythm, and Marcus knew it the way he knew most things, not by thinking about it, but by feeling it. The building filled up between 8 and 9, thinned slightly at lunch, swelled again in the afternoon. He knew which judges ran tight schedules and which ones ran late. He knew which hallways got heavy foot traffic and which ones were quiet enough to mop at any hour. He knew the smell of the building in winter versus spring, the way the marble floors in the main hall held cold longer than the tile in the corridors. He had worked here for 4 years. In that time, he had learned everything about the building and almost nothing about its inhabitants, which was the way of things when you were the man with the mop. People did not see him. They stepped around the caution signs, avoided the wet sections of floor, and continued their conversations without interruption. He did not mind. He had stopped minding a long time ago, in the specific and deliberate way of someone who has decided that visibility is not the thing they are working toward. What he was working toward was simpler and more durable than that. He was working toward a Wednesday afternoon that was calm enough to pick Lily up from school on time. He was working toward the weekend, when they walked to the park 2 blocks over and she fed the ducks and told him about the week in exhaustive and delightful detail. He was working toward the ordinary, continuous life that he had constructed carefully from the wreckage of a different one, and it was enough. It was enough. He had said this to himself often enough that he had stopped needing to check whether it was true. He did not talk about what came before, not to his coworkers, not to his supervisor, not to the neighbors who asked friendly questions in the hallway. He talked about Lily, about the weather, about whatever was in the news that week, and he was pleasant and consistent and entirely opaque about the years before the courthouse job and the third-floor apartment and the 2-bedroom life he had arranged around his daughter's needs. His coworker Jerome had asked once, early on, what Marcus had done before the courthouse. Marcus had said he'd traveled for work. Jerome had nodded and let it go, because men like them had learned long ago that some things were not meant to be pressed. What Marcus had done before the courthouse, before Dana's illness, before the unraveling of everything that the illness set in motion, was this. He had worked for 11 years as a senior intelligence translator for a division of the United States Army that did not appear in any public directory. He had spoken 6 languages fluently: English, Spanish, Guatemalan Spanish, Arabic, Dari, and French. He had worked in 8 countries. He had translated in conditions where the difference between what was said and what was understood could determine whether people lived or died, and he had learned in those years a precision with language that went beyond vocabulary, a sensitivity to register, to implication, to the specific weight of words chosen under pressure. He had not used any of it in 4 years. He had not used it because after Dana died, the part of him that had been capable of doing that work had gone somewhere quiet and stayed there, and he had decided, in the deliberate and self-protective way of someone managing a grief too large for conventional tools, that he was not going to go looking for it. Dana Webb had been a high school English teacher who read 3 books at a time and made the best rice and beans Marcus had ever tasted, and had an opinion about everything, and was never wrong about any of it, at least not in his estimation, which was the only estimation he had ever trusted on the subject. She had teased him about the languages. 6 languages, Marcus? Who needs 6 languages? And he had answered her every time the same way. You never know when one of them is going to matter. She had laughed. She had always laughed. She had been diagnosed 14 months after Lily was born. The illness moved quickly in the way that the worst things moved, not all at once, but steadily, with a patience that felt almost deliberate, taking things in an order that seemed specifically designed to be most difficult. First, the plans they had made. Then the version of the future they had agreed on. Then, on a Tuesday morning in November, when Lily was 2 years old and didn't yet have language for what she was losing, Dana herself. Marcus had taken Lily home from the hospital that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table with her in his lap and not said anything for a very long time. Lily had fallen asleep against his chest. He had sat in the kitchen with his sleeping daughter and the particular silence of an apartment that had lost the person who made it make sense. And he had understood, in the flat and irrefutable way of someone receiving a fact that cannot be argued with, that the life he had been building was going to have to be rebuilt from different materials. He had rebuilt it. It had taken everything he had, and it had cost him things he had not expected to lose: the consulting work, the professional network, the version of himself that could walk into a room full of people speaking a language other than his own and feel at home there. All of it had gone quiet. He had let it go because Lily needed a father who was present more than she needed a father who was exceptional, and he had chosen presence with the same deliberateness with which he had once chosen everything else. He did not regret it. He was certain of this in the way he was certain of most things that had cost him something to decide, not with the lightness of someone who had escaped a difficult choice, but with the steady, load-bearing certainty of someone who had made it and was still standing inside it 4 years later. That was the decision he had been living with on the Monday morning he walked into courtroom 7 with a mop and a yellow caution sign and found an empty chair where the interpreter was supposed to be sitting. The coffee had been spilled by a paralegal who was moving too fast through the corridor outside courtroom 7 at 9:47 in the morning. Marcus had gotten the radio call from the front desk, loaded his cart, and arrived at 9:53. He had propped the courtroom door open to maneuver the cart through, which was why he had a clear line of sight into the room when he stopped. The scene arranged itself in front of him in the practiced, automatic way that his mind had always processed new environments, not as a story, but as a map. Judge Diana Holloway at the bench, expression controlled and displeased. The state's attorneys at their table, composed. The court-appointed attorney at the other table, less composed. Elena Vasquez beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes moving between the judge and the hallway door with the specific anxiety of someone waiting for a thing that was not coming back. The interpreter's chair, empty, and Miguel in the second row, watching his mother. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment. He ran the calculation the way he had always run calculations, quickly, without sentimentality, accounting for the real variables rather than the comfortable ones. He was a maintenance worker in a gray uniform. He had no credentials visible, no identification that would mean anything in this room. The judge had already demonstrated, in the 4 years he had worked this building, that she ran her courtroom with the precision of a closed system and the tolerance for disruption of someone who had spent 30 years on the bench and considered patience a professional courtesy she extended only to people who had earned it. If he walked into that room, he would be removed. Probably immediately, possibly in a way that was worse than doing nothing. He looked at Miguel. The boy's feet did not reach the floor. He was sitting with his hands in his lap, wearing a collared shirt that was too big, watching his mother with the expression of a child who had learned that the adults around him were in charge of something important and that the correct behavior was to wait quietly and hope they got it right. Marcus knew that expression. He reached into his pocket and felt the folded drawing without taking it out. Lily's courtroom, with the small figure in the corner labeled Daddy. Then he set down the mop, straightened his collar, and walked into courtroom 7. He made it 6 steps before the bailiff moved. The bailiff was a heavyset man named Garrett, who had been working courtroom 7 for 9 years and took his responsibilities with the gravity of someone who considered order itself a moral value. He intercepted Marcus at the center aisle with the practiced ease of a man who had redirected lost tourists and agitated defendants and confused witnesses and every other category of person who had wandered into his courtroom without proper authorization. "Sir," Garrett said, positioning himself squarely, "this is an active proceeding. You need to exit the courtroom immediately." Marcus did not stop walking. He also did not escalate. He simply continued at the same pace, which required Garrett to move with him or be walked around, and he kept his eyes on the judge because the judge was the only person whose decision mattered. "Your Honor," Marcus said. His voice was even and clear, carrying to the bench without effort. "My name is Marcus Webb. I work maintenance in this building. I have 6 languages, including Guatemalan Spanish. I'd like to offer my assistance." Garrett had a hand on Marcus's arm now. "Sir?" Judge Holloway raised one finger from the bench. Garrett stopped. The judge looked at Marcus with the expression she used when she was processing something that did not fit any existing category in her considerable experience. It was not a warm expression. It was not an unwelcoming one. It was the expression of a machine running a rapid and thorough assessment. "You work maintenance," she said. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you speak Guatemalan Spanish?" "Fluently, Your Honor, and 5 other languages." A beat passed. Judge Holloway looked at Elena Vasquez, who was watching Marcus with an expression that had moved from confusion to something more careful and attentive. She looked at Miguel, who had stopped looking at his mother and was now looking at Marcus. She looked back at Marcus. He stood in the center aisle in his gray maintenance uniform, hands loose at his sides, not performing patience and not concealing impatience, just standing, the way a man stood when he had nowhere else he needed to be and nothing he needed the room to think of him. Judge Holloway had been on the bench for 31 years. She had seen every variety of person that a courthouse could produce, the desperate and the calculating, the innocent and the guilty, the people who came in knowing exactly what they wanted, and the people who didn't know until they were in the chair. She had developed, over those 31 years, a very precise instrument for detecting the difference between someone who believed what they were saying and someone who merely needed to be believed. What she was reading from the man in the gray uniform was the first kind. Not confidence exactly. Confidence was something people performed. This was something quieter and more structural than that. This was the bearing of someone who had been certain of something for a very long time and had stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. She looked at the empty interpreter's chair. She looked at Miguel in the second row. "Mr. Webb." Her voice had not changed in temperature, but something in its structure had shifted slightly. The specific shift of someone who has decided to make a pragmatic decision and is framing it accordingly. "I want to be clear. This proceeding cannot continue without interpretation. The certified interpreter is medically unavailable. I am not in the habit of accepting ad hoc solutions in my courtroom, and I want the record to reflect that this is a highly irregular situation." "Understood, Your Honor." "I am also not in the habit," she continued, "of allowing a child to sit in this room any longer than necessary while the adults around him fail to find a workable path forward." She paused. "You will be sworn in as a temporary interpreter of record. Any error or omission in your interpretation will be grounds for a mistrial and personal liability. Do you understand what you are agreeing to?" "Yes, Your Honor." The state's lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Kathleen Marsh, was already on her feet. "Your Honor, I must object. This is highly irregular. We have no way to verify this man's qualifications. He is a maintenance worker. For all we know, he took a class at a community college. We cannot allow an unverified civilian to serve as interpreter of record in a custody proceeding of this." "Ms. Marsh." Judge Holloway's tone did not change, but the word landed like a gavel. You are welcome to produce a verified Guatemalan Spanish interpreter within the next 10 minutes. If you can do that, Mr. Webb will return to his work and we will proceed conventionally. Can you do that? Marcia's jaw tightened. She looked at her phone, already calculating. The certified interpreter service they used had one Guatemalan Spanish specialist on their roster. That specialist was currently unconscious in a hallway 2 floors below them. The backup on their list was in a deposition across town. The third name on the list was not answering. A silence. No, Your Honor. Then sit down. Kathleen Marsh sat down. The expression on her face was the particular expression of a woman who had been told to sit down in public by a judge and had sat down and was now arranging her features into something that communicated professional composure, while her interior state communicated something quite different. She looked at Marcus as he walked toward the interpreter's chair. Her gaze was not hostile exactly. It was the gaze of someone filing a person away, cataloging the gray uniform, the work boots, the unhurried walk, and arriving at a conclusion that she had already decided before she had any evidence, because that was the kind of conclusion that felt like knowledge, when it was actually only habit. Marcus did not look back at her. He was sworn in. He took the interpreter's chair, settled into it with the particular stillness of someone returning to a posture their body remembered, and looked at Elena Vasquez across the room. She was watching him with an expression that carried several things simultaneously: fear, hope, the exhausted wariness of someone who had learned not to trust good things until they proved themselves. She was holding her hands together in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. Marcus said to her in Guatemalan Spanish, in the register of someone who understood which dialect she came from and adjusted without thinking about it. My name is Marcus. I'm going to make sure everything that's said in this room reaches you exactly as it was meant. I won't miss anything. Do you understand me? Elena Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. Then she exhaled, a small, controlled exhale, the kind that a person releases when they have been holding something for a very long time and have finally found a place to set it down, and she nodded. The proceeding lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Marcus interpreted every word, not in the mechanical, transactional way of someone converting one language into another as a technical exercise, but in the complete way, catching register, catching implication, catching the specific emotional weight of language used by people under pressure to communicate things that mattered. The first 20 minutes were the most difficult. Not because of the language came back to him the way things came back that had been learned in conditions that didn't allow for forgetting, but because of the room. He had not sat in a professional capacity in 4 years. He had not been the person that other people depended on for precision in 4 years. The weight of it was different than he remembered, or perhaps he had simply forgotten how much it weighed, and the forgetting had been its own kind of protection. He settled into it the way he settled into everything, without announcement, without making a production of the adjustment. He listened to the question, he turned it, he delivered it. He listened to the answer, he turned it, he delivered it. The rhythm of it came back inside the first 10 minutes like a language itself, like the body remembering something the mind had tried to set aside. Elena Vasquez watched him across the room with careful, measuring attention for the first several exchanges. She was calibrating, the way anyone calibrated when their ability to understand what was happening depended entirely on one person they had met 4 minutes ago. Marcus understood this. He did not rush her trust. He simply did the work accurately and let the accuracy speak for itself. By the third exchange, her shoulders had dropped a fraction of an inch. It was a small movement. Marcus noticed it. He caught the moment when Elena's attorney asked her about her work schedule, and her answer contained something the attorney hadn't followed, a reference to a second job she had taken on specifically to fund Miguel's tutoring, which the attorney had not known about, and which became, once Marcus flagged it for clarification, a significant piece of the evidentiary picture. He caught the moment when the state's examiner asked Elena a question in a phrasing that had a different implication in Guatemalan Spanish than in standard Spanish, a distinction that would have been missed by any interpreter who wasn't specifically familiar with the regional dialect, and he interpreted it accurately and then said to the court, quietly and precisely, "For the record, Your Honor, the phrasing of that question carries a different implicature in the witness's primary dialect than in standard Castilian Spanish. I want the court to be aware of that distinction." Judge Holloway looked at him over the top of her glasses for a long moment. Kathleen Marsh was on her feet before the judge could respond. "Your Honor, I object." The interpreter's role is to translate, not to editorialize on the interpreter's role, Judge Holloway said, with the specific patience of someone who had been doing this for 31 years and had long since stopped finding objections surprising, is to ensure that the communication between parties is accurate and complete. If there is a dialectical distinction that affects the meaning of a question asked of a witness in a custody proceeding, I want to know about it. She looked at Marcus. "Noted, Mr. Webb. Thank you." Marsh sat down. The expression on her face had shifted slightly from its earlier configuration, the first small crack in the certainty she had walked in with. He caught the moment when Elena described the morning they came for Miguel. She had been in the kitchen making breakfast, eggs and toast, the same breakfast she made every morning, when the social worker arrived with a police officer. She had not understood at first what was happening. The documents they handed her were in English. She had asked them to wait while she called someone who could read them. They had not waited. Marcus translated this passage with the same precision he brought to everything else. He did not soften it. He did not editorialize. He simply converted it from one language to another and let it exist in the English-speaking room in its full weight. The social worker sitting beside Miguel pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. And then there was the word. Near the end of the second hour, during Elena's direct testimony, she had been asked to describe the last morning before Miguel was taken, what she remembered, what she wanted the court to know. She had spoken for several minutes in the careful, measured way of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say and is holding on to the rehearsed version because they are afraid that the unrehearsed version will come apart. And then, near the end of the answer, she had used a single word in Guatemalan Spanish that had no clean equivalent in English. A word that meant something between waiting and hoping and not yet giving up. A word that existed in that language because the people who spoke it had needed a word for that specific condition often enough to make one. Marcus translated it as faithfully as English allowed, which was not faithfully enough, and he knew it as he said it. And the knowing of it moved through him in a way that had nothing to do with professional precision and everything to do with the 4 years he had spent in the apartment on the 3rd floor doing exactly what that word described. Her voice broke on it, just on that word, not before and not after. Marcus interpreted the words accurately and completely, and then he was quiet. Because the silence after the word was also part of what she was saying, and the courtroom needed to receive it. Several people in the room received it. Garrett, the bailiff, was looking at the floor. The social worker, sitting beside Miguel, had her hand pressed briefly to her mouth before she composed herself. Even Kathleen Marsh, midway through writing something on her legal pad, had stopped writing. Miguel was looking at his mother. He had been looking at her for most of the 2 hours and 40 minutes with the focused, unblinking attention of a child trying to transmit something across a room by the force of wanting it badly enough. The ruling came at 12:58. Judge Holloway reviewed her notes for a full 4 minutes in silence, the kind of silence she enforced on everyone else, and observed herself with equal discipline. And then she delivered it in the measured, precise language of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and had not lost the understanding that the words she was about to say would be carried home by everyone in this room and lived with. The state had not met its burden. The evidence presented by the Department of Child Services was insufficient to justify continued removal. Elena Vasquez had demonstrated, through her testimony and the supporting documentation, a consistent and genuine commitment to her son's welfare. The removal order was vacated. Miguel would be returned to his mother's care, pending a standard follow-up review in 90 days. Elena Vasquez put her hands over her face. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder. Miguel, 7 years old, collared shirt too big, feet still not quite reaching the floor, looked at his mother for one more moment. Then he got up from his seat, walked past the social worker, past the state's table, across the center aisle, and stood in front of her. She took her hands away from her face and looked at her son, and then she pulled him against her with both arms in the specific and total way that people hold things they thought they might lose. Nobody in the courtroom looked away. Marcus sat in the interpreter's chair and watched, and felt something move through his chest that he had not had a name for in a long time. Not pride, not satisfaction, something older and quieter than both. The specific weight of a thing done correctly. The particular feeling of a skill used in the service of something that deserved it. He thought about Dana, the way he thought about her in moments like this, not with the old sharpness, the grief that had lived in him like a splinter for years after she died, but with something softer and more complex. The way you thought about someone you had loved and lost and were still, in various ways, in conversation with. He thought about the languages she had teased him about. 6 languages, Marcus. Who needs 6 languages? And the way he had answered her every time. You never know when one of them is going to matter. He reached into his pocket and felt the drawing. Then he stood, straightened his uniform shirt, and walked toward the exit. He was in the corridor, retrieving the mop cart from where he had left it, when the door opened behind him. It was not Judge Holloway, and it was not Elena Vasquez, and it was not Garrett. It was Kathleen Marsh, the state's lead attorney, still holding her legal pad, who had come through the door alone and without the professional composure she had maintained throughout the preceding 2 hours and 40 minutes. She stood in the corridor and looked at him with the expression of someone who had something to say and was still working out whether they were going to say it. Marcus waited, the way he always waited, without filling the silence, without making it easier or harder for her. "Where did you learn Guatemalan Spanish?" she said. "I worked as a translator," Marcus said. "Army intelligence, 11 years. She absorbed this. Her eyes went to the gray maintenance uniform, to the mop cart, back to his face. "The thing you caught," she said. The implicature difference in the phrasing. That would have, if that had gone through as a standard interpretation, the ruling might have gone differently, Marcus said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without softening it into something easier. Kathleen Marsh was quiet for a moment. She was a careful woman, and the care was visible now in a way it had not been visible during the proceeding. Not the professional carefulness of someone managing a case, but the quieter carefulness of someone sitting with information they had not expected to receive and were trying to hold accurately. "I objected to you," she said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the directness of someone who did not believe that dressing things up made them more honest. "You were right to," Marcus said. "You didn't know anything about me." "I still don't know anything about you." "No," he said. "You don't." She stood with that for a moment. She looked at the mop cart. She looked back at him. "Army intelligence," she said. 11 years. 6 languages. She said it the way people said things they were still in the process of understanding. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. Something in between. "And you're here?" "Yes," Marcus said. "Why?" It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, without the professional framing that would have made it easier for both of them. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He thought about what to say and how much of it was true, and whether the full truth was something he owed to this particular person in this particular corridor. He decided it was. "My daughter needed a father who came home," he said. "This job lets me come home." Kathleen Marsh received this without comment. She stood with it for a moment, the way you stood with something that had rearranged the furniture of a room you thought you knew. Then she said, not as a performance, and not with the professional warmth of someone who had decided the correct political response, just as a statement of fact. "You did good work in there." Marcus nodded once. She went back through the door. He stood in the corridor for a moment after she left. The building continued its afternoon around him. Footsteps, voices, a door closing somewhere down the hall. The ambient percussion of a working courthouse. None of it was paying attention to him. He was, as he had been for 4 years, the man in the gray uniform that people stepped around. He picked up the mop cart. Then the door opened again. It was not Kathleen Marsh this time. It was Judge Holloway herself, without her robe, which she had apparently removed before stepping out, wearing instead a dark blazer and the expression of someone who had a specific thing to say and had decided to say it personally rather than through channels. Marcus stood where he was. Judge Holloway looked at him for a moment with the same careful, assessing attention she had directed at him from the bench. Up close, without the elevation of the bench between them, she was shorter than she appeared in court, and older, the specific age of someone who had spent decades in a room where the stakes were always real, and had the quality of attention that came from that. "Mr. Webb," she said. "Your Honor." "I've been on the bench for 31 years, she said. "I have presided over several thousand proceedings. I have had certified interpreters, sworn interpreters, telephonic interpretation services, and on one occasion a bilingual court officer who did his best and whose best was adequate." She paused. "I have never, in 31 years, had an interpreter stop the proceedings to flag a dialectical implicature distinction that affected the fairness of a question." Marcus said nothing. "That's not a criticism," Judge Holloway said. "I want to be clear about that." She looked at him steadily. "It is an observation about the difference between someone who knows a language and someone who understands it." She did not ask him any questions. She did not ask about his background or his credentials, or why he was mopping floors in a courthouse when he apparently had 11 years of specialized intelligence work behind him. She had, Marcus understood, already decided that these questions were his to answer or not answer as he chose, and that her role in this corridor was not to extract information, but to say something she had decided needed to be said. "The boy goes home tonight," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. She nodded once, the same kind of nod Marcus had given Kathleen Marsh, the nod that acknowledged without requiring anything further, and then she went back through the door. Marcus stood in the corridor for another moment. Then he picked up the mop cart and went back to work. He was loading the cart into the service elevator when Jerome appeared at the end of the corridor with the expression he wore when something had happened that he hadn't been told about and felt he should have been. "Garrett radioed me," Jerome said. "Said you went in there and interpreted a whole custody trial." "Part of one," Marcus said. Jerome looked at him for a long moment. Jerome was 56 years old and had worked the courthouse for 12 years and had, in that time, developed a precise and reliable sense for when someone he knew was more than they appeared to be. He had suspected this about Marcus for approximately 3 years. He had never said anything because some things were not meant to be pressed. He said something now. 6 languages. 6 languages, Marcus confirmed. Jerome was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular simplicity of someone who had chosen their words carefully, "Good thing you were in the hallway." "Yes," Marcus said. Jerome nodded and went back to his work. He picked Lily up from school at 3:15, the same as always. She came down the steps with her backpack and her opinions already assembled, and she told him on the walk home about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate about whether horses or elephants were smarter, a topic she had strong views on and was prepared to defend at length. Marcus listened to every word. At the kitchen table, while she worked through her homework, he made dinner, the pasta she liked, with the sauce from the jar she had picked out at the grocery store because it had a picture of a tomato on the label that she found aesthetically satisfying. He set the table. They ate. She told him more about the horse versus elephant debate, which had apparently continued at recess and would likely continue tomorrow. After dinner, while she was in the bath, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and sat with the day. Not running it back, not analyzing it, just letting it settle the way things settled when you gave them room. He thought about Miguel in his too big shirt. He thought about Elena Vasquez's hands folded in her lap. He thought about the word she had used, the one that had broken in her voice, and the silence that followed it. He thought about Lily in the bathtub, conducting what sounded like a complex diplomatic negotiation between two rubber ducks. He reached into his pocket and took out the drawing for the first time all day. The courtroom with the large judge and the small figure in the corner. Daddy, in careful letters. He sat with it for a while. Then he folded it back along its original creases and put it in his pocket. And he went to run the bathwater down and get his daughter into pajamas and read the chapter she would choose and sit in the specific warmth of the life he had built, which was quiet and ordinary and completely, irreversibly his. 3 weeks later, Marcus received a letter. It came to the courthouse, addressed to Marcus Webb, maintenance staff, Hendricks County Courthouse, in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven in the way of someone who had learned a second alphabet as an adult. Inside was a single page. He read it standing in the corridor outside the service elevator, still holding the envelope. Elena Vasquez had written it in Guatemalan Spanish. She wrote that Miguel was home. She wrote that he had slept in his own bed for the first time in 4 months and had asked for the same breakfast 3 mornings in a row. Eggs and toast, the same thing she had made him every morning before. She wrote that she had tried to explain to him what had happened in the courtroom, who Marcus was and what he had done, and that Miguel had listened very carefully and then said, in the way that 7-year-olds said things, he seemed like a dad. Marcus stood in the corridor and read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, beside the drawing. He picked up his cart and went back to work. Outside the courthouse windows, the city continued its ordinary afternoon. Traffic and voices and the unremarkable percussion of a world that contained, within it, all the things that needed to be said, and all the people still looking for someone who could hear them. There was no credential for that. There was no title. There was only the willingness to walk into the room when walking away was easier, and to use whatever you carried, in your hands, in your memory, in the languages that had lived in you through everything you had survived, in the service of someone who needed it more than you needed the comfort of staying invisible. Marcus had been invisible for 4 years. He was not sure, walking back down the corridor with his cart, that he was going to be invisible for 4 more. But that was a decision for another morning. For today, there was the building, the floors, the corridors, the marble in the main hall that held cold longer than the tile. The rhythm of it, which he knew the way he knew most things, not by thinking about it, but by feeling it underfoot. He had work to do. He did it. The most important thing a person can offer is not their title. It's the willingness to use what they know when someone needs it, even when staying quiet would cost them nothing. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more people like Marcus out there, and their stories deserve to be heard.